On November 25th, 1934, in a meeting hall in Dendermonde, just outside Ghent, Arsène Goedertier, 57 years old, stocky and short with a waxed mustache curled tight at the ends, collapses during a Catholic political party meeting. He had a heart attack. He's revived long enough to be moved to his brother-in-law's house, where he loses consciousness again. When he comes to, he asks only one question. Am I in any danger? He is, but not necessarily from the heart attack. As he lies dying, a Benedictine priest offers him last rites, the final sacrament, the chance to confess and receive absolution before meeting God. Goedertier refuses. My conscience is at peace, he says. Which is a strange thing to say when you're about to die, unless you genuinely believe it. So instead of a priest, he asks for his lawyer. Georges D.U.A arrives within the hour. He meets with Goedertier privately for 15 minutes. His children would later recall the timing, though they claimed not to know what was said. When D.U.A emerges, Goedertier is dead. The lawyer's face is pale and drained of color. He says nothing to anyone in the room. Not to the family, not to the priest, not to the doctor who tried to save him. He just gets in his car and drives. But he doesn't go to the police. Instead, he drives 8 miles southeast to Wetteren, to Goedertier's home, where Goedertier's wife, Julienne, lets him in. In the study, in the top right-hand drawer of the desk, in a file marked Mutualité, D.U.A finds exactly what Goedertier whispered about with his dying breath. Carbon copies of 13 ransom letters, all signed D.U.A. There's also one final letter, undelivered, handwritten on letterhead from Goedertier's failed business venture, rambling and full of cross-outs and incomplete thoughts. D.U.A reads them. Then he gets back in his car. And still, he doesn't go to the police. This time, he drives to meet with 4 colleagues, all legal magistrates. The president of the Tribunal of Dendermonde, the president of the Ghent Court of Appeals, the district attorney, and Frans de Heem, the Crown prosecuting attorney who had taken over ransom negotiations 7 months earlier with D.U.A, following the theft of one panel split in 2 from the wings of the Ghent Altarpiece. The 5 men meet in private. They decide together to conduct their own investigation. No police involvement, no public announcement. Just the 5 of them, searching for answers to a question no one seems eager to ask out loud. What really happened to the righteous judge's panel? But here's what makes that decision strange. Magistrates can investigate minor crimes on their own, but a theft of this magnitude, the disappearance of a panel from one of the world's most important artworks, that requires police. That requires transparency, forensic work, and public accountability. But for 1 full month, these 5 men investigate alone. And when they finally, reluctantly, bring in the police in December 1934, most of the evidence has already been handled, examined, interpreted, and filed away by lawyers who may have had their own reasons for controlling the narrative. So here's the question we're left with. Why didn't Georges D.U.A go to the police when his client confessed to stealing a masterpiece? Why did the most powerful legal minds in the region decide to investigate in secret? What were they protecting? Or, more precisely, who? I'm Emma Laramie, and this is Verso. Let's go back 7 months to the night of the theft. April 10th, 1934 was a mild spring evening in Ghent. The sun had slipped behind the chimneys and gabled roofs as Beadle Van Volsum, plump, disheveled, and perpetually running late, made his final rounds through Saint Bavo Cathedral. He ushered out the last parishioners and sightseers, checked the clock, fumbled with his enormous ring of keys until he found the right one, and locked the main door behind him. He's due for dinner at the bishop's residence, and he's already late. Inside, the maintenance crew sweeps the floors, empties the coin boxes beneath the votive candles, and dusts the niches behind stone sculptures. When they finish, they exit through a side door and lock it behind them. Darkness falls. The cathedral is silent. Except it isn't. Because somewhere in the shadows of the rude loft, the elevated gallery that runs above the nave, someone is waiting. The next morning, April 11th, at 5 a.m., Van Volsum begins his rounds again. But he notices that the side door is ajar. Curious, but not immediately alarming. It had been left unlocked before accidentally and more than once. It isn't until 7:30 that he reaches the Deathbed chapel and sees the broken padlock on the door. When he opens it, the Ghent Altarpiece stands there with its wings closed, exactly as it should be on a weekday. But something is wrong. Through the closed wings, he can see the interior panel, the adoration of the mystic lamb, which should only be visible when the wings are open. Which means a panel is missing. Van Volsum runs to the office of Canon Gabriel van de Heijn, the same man who 20 years earlier had coordinated the secret network that kept the altarpiece hidden from German forces during World War I, the same man who had risked his life lying to occupiers who had overseen the painting's triumphant return in 1920. Van de Heijn summons the police. But by the time anyone with authority arrives, the word has already spread. Crowds flood into the cathedral to see the empty space where the panel had been, trampling over whatever evidence might have existed, touching the frame, pressing close to stare at the absence. If there had been fingerprints, they're gone now. If there had been footprints, they're obliterated. When investigators finally push through to examine the scene, they find only one clue, a note pinned to the frame. It read in block letters, "Taken from Germany by the Treaty of Versailles." The message seems clear enough. It's revenge, a grudge still festering from the war's end, from the humiliating reparations that forced Germany to return looted art. The Ghent Altarpiece had only been fully reunited in 1921, after Germany was compelled to hand over the panels they believed were rightfully theirs. Maybe this was payback. Maybe this was nationalism dressed up as theft. Except nothing about this theft would turn out to be what it seemed. The missing panel, or panels really because it had been split vertically down the middle, showed two images. On the exterior, visible when the altarpiece was closed, was St. John the Baptist, painted in grisaille to look like a stone sculpture. On the interior, visible when it was open, was the righteous judges, also called the just judges, which showed a procession of nobles on horseback riding toward the mystic lamb. Both sides had special meaning for Ghent. John the Baptist was the city's patron saint, featured on the city seal and the cathedral's namesake until 1540. The Righteous Judges panel was thought to contain hidden portraits of its creators, Jan and Hubert van Eyck, as well as Philip the Good, who was Duke of Burgundy at the time of the altarpiece's creation. In 1826, a British artist named John Linnell had made an engraving of the Judges panel specifically, and it circulated widely enough that by the 20th century, This panel had become one of the most famous sections of the entire altarpiece. It was recognizable, iconic, and historically significant. If you wanted to steal something that would generate maximum outrage and maximum leverage, this was the panel you would take. The theft had been carried out with precision. The antique iron hinges holding the panel in place had been carefully removed, and the panel pried from its frame, likely with a screwdriver, something that would have required carpentry skill and knowledge of how the altarpiece was constructed. The frame had splintered where the panel was removed, but otherwise nothing else was damaged. No other panels were touched. The thief had been surgical, focused, and intimately understanding of their work. No fingerprints, no footprints, nothing left behind except that note about Versailles, which would later turn out to be a red herring. The only potential witness was a passerby who reported seeing a light on in the vid chapel at around 11:15 p.m. the night of the theft. That was it. That was all the police had to work with. And then the investigation quickly began to fall apart in ways that seemed less like incompetence and more like choreography. The first officer to arrive at the scene was Inspector Patin. He was late, delayed, he claimed, by a report of stolen cheese from a Ghent cheesemonger. When he finally reached the cathedral, he made a series of decisions that would seem baffling if you assumed he was trying to solve the crime. He didn't evacuate the building or seal off the area. He didn't take photographs or dust for fingerprints. He didn't call the federal police, though they showed up anyway. And when Inspector Antoine Loisterbosch of the federal police arrived to take over, Patina excused himself to return to the matter of the stolen cheese. From the beginning, the investigation was strange. Not just sloppy, fully strange. Deliberately, almost performatively inadequate. And contemporaries noticed. Journalists noticed. Even now, nearly a century later, it's hard to look at the sequence of events and not wonder what on earth they were possibly thinking. The theft occurred barely more than a decade after the altarpiece had been fully reunited, after years of separation and wartime hiding. Just 4 years earlier, in 1930, the painting had been displayed outdoors during Belgium's centenary celebration of independence, a triumphant symbol of national unity and survival. It had become more than art by this point. It was a talisman and proof that Belgium could endure anything. And now, in the spring of 1934, it was incomplete again. And the people tasked with finding it seemed determined not to. The timing of the theft is also significant. Belgium was in the grip of a national crisis. The Great Depression had triggered a recession, leading to rampant unemployment and a surge in religious fervor. There were multiple reported sightings of the Virgin Mary, signs that people were desperate for miracles. The first 3 months of 1934 had been especially brutal. On February 18th of that year, King Albert I died under suspicious circumstances. Officially from a fall while hiking, though many believed foul play was involved. And on March 28th, the Socialist Bank of Labor declared bankruptcy, causing thousands of small investors to lose their savings. Weeks later, Belgium's largest bank, the General Bank Union, announced massive losses and nearly went bankrupt itself. Belgium in this moment was a country on edge, with institutions crumbling and trust eroding. And amidst that chaos, someone stole the most important panel from the most important painting in Belgium. The public was outraged, not just about the theft, but about the lack of security, the incompetence of the investigation, and the sense that nobody in power seemed to care. It was the most prominent art theft since the Mona Lisa had been stolen from the Louvre in 1911, and it was being treated like a nuisance. 3 days after the theft, Canon Gabriel van de Heijn, the man who had saved the altarpiece during World War I, gave an interview, saying, quote, "I imagine this must be the work of foreigners, and I am close to certain that it is for the purposes of blackmail," end quote. But 1 day later, van de Heijn published an editorial in another newspaper, L'Indépendance Belge, in which he stated, quote, "Now that I've had time to recover my senses and consider it, I think that this must be a crime of vengeance," end quote. 2 different theories in 2 days. Was he guessing? Or did he know more than he was letting on? The question would hang over van de Heijn for the rest of his life. 20 days after the theft, on April 30th, 1934, Bishop Honoré Joseph Coppieters received a letter in a pale green envelope. It was a ransom note, written in French, polite but insistent. The author identified himself only as D.U.A. He claimed to be part of a group. He kept saying "we," though he made it clear that only one person knew the actual location of the panels. He offered a deal. He'd return the St. John the Baptist panel first as proof of good faith. Once the bishop received it, he was to hand over 1 million Belgian francs in specific denominations: 90 notes of 10,000 francs, 100 notes of 1,000 francs, wrapped and sealed with the diocese seal. The serial numbers could not be registered, and the authorities had to drop the case indefinitely. The letter ended with a philosophical flourish, saying, quote, "We understand that the demanded amount is high, but 1 million can be regained, whereas a Van Eyck can never be painted again," end quote. It was both a threat and an appeal to reason. D.U.A. was positioning himself not as a criminal, but as a pragmatist, someone who understood value, someone who expected the bishop to be equally pragmatic. Bishop Coppieters wanted to pay. He believed the ransom was worth it, and that recovering the panel mattered more than catching the thief. But the Crown Prosecutor, Frans de Heem, and the Belgian Minister of Justice refused to go along with it. They wanted to catch the criminals, not reward them. So the police, under Inspector Loisterbourg's direction, advised the bishop to feign compliance. On May 14th and 15th, as D.U.A. had requested, a classified ad appeared in the newspaper La Dernière Heure. But it didn't say what D.U.A. had asked for. Instead it read, quote, "D.U.A. exaggerated proposition," end quote. It was a calculated insult, a refusal disguised as engagement. And D.U.A. didn't take it well. The second letter arrived on May 20th. Still polite, but strained. If total agreement wasn't given, D.U.A. warned, they would begin cutting sections off the panel and mailing them to the diocese. But then, almost apologetically, he offered the bishop a bribe. Quote, "Monsignor, because we handle this case almost as a commercial one, and the objects actually belong to a third party, it is fair to pay you a commission of 5%, of which you may dispose freely," end quote. It was strange, that line about the objects belonging to a third party. As if D.U.A. himself wasn't the owner, wasn't even the thief, but merely the middleman. As if someone else had commissioned this whole operation, and D.U.A. was just trying to broker a deal. Attorney de Heem then took over the negotiations, writing as if he were the bishop. The Belgian government, meanwhile, began applying pressure, insisting that the painting was ultimately the property of the Belgian state, merely on loan to the bishopric. This was a matter of national urgency, they said. And yet, curiously, they offered no funds to help with the ransom. The authorities then made a counteroffer: 25,000 francs for the recovery of the panel. It was a paltry sum compared to what D.U.A. had demanded, less than a tenth of the original request. To many observers, it seemed like a strange lack of enthusiasm on the part of the church. The bishopric claimed it didn't have sufficient funds to mount a serious ransom attempt, but if this were truly a national issue, why didn't the government intervene with money of its own? These questions remain unresolved. But an anonymous benefactor, identified only as a mason, eventually offered a reward of 500,000 francs. But even that yielded no real leads. What the letters did reveal, though, was that the note about the Treaty of Versailles was probably a red herring. If this had been an act of nationalist revenge, if the thief wanted to deprive Ghent of the panel permanently, they wouldn't be negotiating for its return. They would have destroyed it or smuggled it out of the country. So this theft wasn't about reprisal. It was about money in a time of desperate financial crisis. Under continued pressure, the bishop and police submitted another classified ad, saying, quote, D.U.A., as agreed with authorities, we accept your proposition fully, end quote. The third letter arrived soon after with instructions. It contained a ticket for the luggage check at the Brussels Nord train station. Inspector Leuchterbusch and Attorney Tahim traveled to Brussels. They presented the ticket at the station and were handed a package, roughly 52 by 20 inches, that was wrapped in black wax paper. The luggage attendant recalled only that the man who deposited it was about 50 years old and he had a pointy beard with no other distinguishing features. They brought the package back to Ghent, to the Episcopal Palace, and had museum experts examine it. It was confirmed. The original St. John the Baptist panel, the exterior half of the stolen work, was here and it was unharmed. But the police, in a questionable move, didn't tell anyone about its return. But then on May 31st, the newspaper L'Indépendance Belge published an article about the panel's recovery. Someone had leaked the information. Was there a rat among the police? Among the diocese? The fourth letter arrived on June 1st. D.U.A. was now involving a new middleman, Father Henri Malapis, a vicar at St. Laurentius Church in Antwerp. The letter instructed the bishop to hand over the ransom package to Father Malapis, along with a vertically torn page from a newspaper. Whoever came to collect it would present the matching half as proof of identity. When police interviewed Father Malapis, he claimed to know nothing. Through the brass gate of a confession booth, he said, someone had asked if he would help a prominent Belgian family recover letters that would otherwise ruin the royal house. He had agreed. No, he didn't know who was confessing. Confession relied on anonymity, and even if he knew, he wouldn't tell lest he violate his vows. Was he telling the truth? Or was he Belgium's best actor? One thing was clear, though. The thief was using the secrecy of the confessional booth to operate with impunity. Tahim continued to answer under the bishop's name, trying to lure D.U.A. into a trap. He published a series of classified ads stalling for time. Quote, letter received. Pursuant to indiscretions involved, please be patient for a few days, end quote. Then, package will be handed over on June 9th. The next series of letters exposed D.U.A.'s increasing wariness and frustration. Though publication in a newspaper's classified section was hardly a legal contract, D.U.A. repeatedly insisted that the bishop publish his renunciation of legal proceedings, as if that would somehow make him exempt from prosecution. It showed both a lack of understanding of legal matters and a strange reliance on what he called a gentleman's agreement. He would return the painting and collect the reward, and the bishop should play along like a good and honorable victim. On June 13th, Tahim finally published the phrase D.U.A. had been demanding, quote, full pledge that secret will be kept, act without concern, End quote. Hollow words, but they seem to provide moral support if nothing else. On June 14th, the police presented Father Melapis with a sealed package, as D.U.A. had demanded. But it didn't contain 1 million francs. Inside were only 25,000 francs, with the serial numbers carefully noted, and a letter that read, quote, "In this envelope Monseigneur hands over, for the grisaille, 2 notes of 10,000 francs and 5 notes of 1,000 francs, or 25,000 francs, of which he assures you that he has not noted the serial numbers and that no one has seen them. Contrary to his expectations, he cannot raise the demanded amount, but he will pay the amount of 225,000 francs afterwards, or at the moment the judges are delivered. These are take-it-or-leave-it conditions. The bishop cannot do more. Because of the nature of this case, it is not possible to call for a public subscription. The bishop gives you the certainty that the case is closed and that nothing will be done to further seek out the persons responsible." End quote. The letter not only gave D.U.A. a taste of his own medicine, but made it clear that he had not been speaking exclusively to the bishop. He's referred to in the third person. So the ruse was exposed. The next letter, the 8th in the series, expressed dismay, saying, quote, "It seems unnecessary to underline how distressed we were reading the enclosed letter. Breaking up an agreement at such a moment, while we have committed ourselves at the payment of a relatively small commission to hand over to you the most valuable object in the world, the loss of which will keep troubling those who are the cause of this. It is incomprehensible. And to undermine the mutual trust, so essential for the delicate and difficult negotiations on this enormous piece of art. It is dreadful. We risked our lives to come into possession of these 2 jewels, and we keep thinking that what we ask is not excessive or impossible to realize." End quote. There was something almost plaintive in the tone. D.U.A. wasn't threatening to destroy the panel. He was hurt, disappointed, appealing to fairness. These were the words of an amateur criminal, someone who genuinely believed there was honor in this transaction, that a deal was a deal. But the police felt confident. D.U.A. wouldn't destroy the righteous judge's panel. He'd already given up his only bargaining chip by returning the St. John. If he damaged the judges, he'd get no ransom at all. So they could wait. Let him reveal himself. The police replied simply, quote, "Regret to have to maintain the proposition in our letter," end quote. On July 6th, the 9th letter arrived, asking for revised terms. 500,000 francs now, and 400,000 within 12 months of the panel's return. The police replied, "Maintain our last proposition." In letter number 10, frustration bubbled over when D.U.A. said, quote, "Because you did not respond at all to our last letter, the situation is very clear. But since the cessation of negotiations depends on us, we will offer you one last opportunity to reach us, in the usual manner, by July 28th. When at that moment no suitable solution has been reached, this will mean a definite break in negotiations, with all the consequences connected to it. And no one in this world, not even one of us, will get the opportunity to see the immortal peace, which will be lost forever. It will stay where it is now, without anyone being able to touch it. That will be the implication of your decision," end quote. But police wanted this emotional slip. The letter revealed that D.U.A. didn't have immediate possession of the panel. It was hidden somewhere safe, somewhere it wouldn't be discovered by accident. Therefore, there was no real threat of it being destroyed. It would simply stay hidden, untouched, if no ransom were paid. So the police stalled further, saying, "Confirming last proposition." D.U.A. wrote back asking for clarification. Was the last proposition his or theirs? Quote, "Because we do not want to break negotiations due to a misunderstanding, we hurry to ask you for a more explicit response," end quote. But the letter ended with a promise. No more letters. But he'd check the newspaper on the first of every month should the bishop decide to comply. Even after claiming finality, D.U.A. couldn't stay away. The 11th letter arrived on September 8th, and the tone had shifted. The politeness was gone. D.U.A. stopped pretending to be part of a group, saying, quote, "We regret it personally that you have not given the bishop the means that would have avoided our anger at the qualified authorities, who have not kept their word and promises. D.U.A. is not able to say more about this, nor to give further instructions, but he dares to believe that this letter will make you think seriously. Meanwhile, the masterpiece still rests in the same place that only D.U.A. knows, and of which he has not even entrusted the secret to a piece of paper," end quote. The police remained firm, saying, quote, "Letter received. Regret to have to maintain earlier proposition," end quote. The 12th letter dropped whatever pretense was still remaining. D.U.A. was writing as I now, singular and alone, saying, quote, "I already foresaw that you would not pay enough attention to my personal letter. I regret this firmly. One will have to admit that you and the authorities have a different opinion than us in this case about the meaning of a commitment. I personally start to believe that you have never possessed the 250,000 francs promised in the counteroffer, and that you may never have had any intention to pay it. Allow me now to say, you maneuvered badly, and it would have been better if you had let me keep the St. John," end quote. The slip from we to I suggested fatigue and isolation, and the repeated focus on the bishop, even knowing by now that he had nothing to do with the negotiations, suggested something personal. Perhaps D.U.A. knew the bishop personally. Perhaps he had expected him to play along, to understand, and was deeply disappointed that he didn't. Then, on October 1st, the 13th and final letter arrived. It said, quote, "You thought it was unnecessary to reply to my last personal letter. I understand that you did not like certain phrases in it, because no one likes to have his back against the wall you built for yourself. But that is of subordinate importance. We have come to the dead end, the point where you will have to accept our conditions to once more possess the work, or bear upon your shoulders everything you provoked, without hope to recover what only I can deliver to you. Allow me to conclude that I have tried everything in my power to save the righteous judges. After having tried everything within our power, and despite your continuously repeating impossible to realize counteroffers, I believe I fully performed my duty as a leader," end quote. I have tried everything in my power to save the righteous judges. That word, save, not ransom, not return, save. As if D.U.A. believed genuinely that he was the painting's protector, its savior, the only one who truly understood what it was worth. 6 weeks of silence followed. The police had handled the ransom demands reasonably well, but they were stringing along a fish they could never reel in. The rest of the investigation would be pocked with oversights, bumblings, and inexplicable decisions. And then, something happened that sounded so preposterously melodramatic, it could only appear in a work of fiction. We're back again at November 25th, 1934. Arsène Goedertier collapses at a Catholic political party meeting, dies hours later, refuses last rites, whispers a confession to his lawyer. And 1 month later, that confession is revealed to the world. Arsène Goedertier was D.U.A. Or at least, that's what George DeVoe claimed. So who was Arsène Goedertier? He was born December 23, 1876, in Lied, a town near Ghent, one of 12 children born to a primary school headmaster. His father, Emile, eventually resigned over a school funding controversy and became sacristan at the local church of St. Gertrude in Wetteren, just outside Ghent. Arsène became the organist there, then succeeded his father as sacristan from 1911 to 1919. He once said rather enigmatically, quote, "The biggest mistake my father made was turning me into a sacristan," end quote. Goedertier was short, overweight, with a thickly curled wax mustache, pince-nez glasses, a receding hairline, and oversized ears that seemed too low on his head. He was also an artist of minor distinction, having studied at both the Royal Academy of Art in Dendermonde and the Art Academy in Wetteren, where he later became managing director. A portrait he painted was hung in the town hall of Wetteren in 1913. His favorite subject was church interiors. He had also been a schoolmate of Honoré Joseph Coppieters, the man who would become Bishop of Ghent. Alongside his post as sacristan, Goedertier worked as a clerk in a Wetteren suburb from 1911 to 1919. He avoided military service because of an ocular defect that made it impossible for him to see in low-light conditions, a detail that would later seem significant. After 1919, he worked as a stockbroker, becoming a regular in financial circles. He remained an active member of Catholic political and social groups. He taught drawing and weaving at the professional school in Kalken, was an accomplished amateur tailor, enjoyed puzzles involving mechanics, designed blueprints for new airplane models that were never purchased, and owned an extensive collection of detective and spy novels. The police would eventually confiscate that entire collection. It included the complete works of Maurice Leblanc, whose recurring character was Arsène Lupin, gentleman art thief, master of disguise, charming criminal, and a man who shared his first name with Goedertier. Goedertier may have felt a kinship. On November 3, 1915, Goedertier married Julienne Mine, a Paris-born heiress to a knitting goods company. She would later say that Arsène spoke frequently and with great fascination about the judge's theft. Even before it happened, she meant. He was obsessed with the painting, with the altarpiece, with the idea of something so beautiful being so vulnerable. They had one son who they referred to as Dede. Born in 1922, plagued with health problems, including a chronic eye disease inherited from his father that made it difficult to see in the dark. He also showed signs of mental illness. He was confirmed at Saint Bavo Cathedral, anointed by Bishop Coppieters, Arsène's old schoolmate. When he died at 14 on May 2, 1936, 2 years after the theft, he was babbling incoherently, repeating two words over and over: police and thieves. After World War I, Goedertier and his wife established a brokerage office in a former Dominican convent in downtown Ghent. They profited considerably for a short period, living in a spacious home in Wetteren with unusual amenities for the time, like central heating and servants, 2 telephone lines, and a white Chevy automobile. Then, in 1928, Goedertier founded an organization called Plantexel with the goal of establishing coffee and palm oil plantations in the Congo. It declared bankruptcy a few days before his death. But here's the strange part. The theft didn't seem to be a way to save the company. Goedertier died a wealthy man with 3 million francs in his bank account. And since 1930, 4 years before the theft, Goedertier had been in possession of a fake passport containing his photograph but registered under the name Van Dam, AVD, which reversed is kind of like D.U.A. So the confession he made on his deathbed seemed to play out. The carbon copies of the letters in his desk, the fake passport, there was a typewriter rented under the name Van Dam, the obsession with the altarpiece, the connection to the bishop, it all pointed to Goedertier. Except for the logistics. Goedertier was short, overweight, and physically weak, and the panels were massive and unwieldy. He couldn't have lifted and carried them alone. And then there was also his eye condition. He couldn't see in low light. He couldn't have navigated a dark cathedral by himself without tripping over pews, much less stolen a painting. Which meant Goedertier didn't act alone. So who else was involved? And why did Goedertier take the fall? Here's where we need to return to the financial crisis of 1934 and break down the prevailing theory that explains almost everything, except why everyone involved chose silence over justice. In the winter of 1933 and into early 1934, Belgium was in freefall. Banks were collapsing, fortunes were evaporating. The nouveau riche who had built their wealth in the post-war boom were suddenly and catastrophically broke. And some of those newly desperate people were pillars of the Catholic community in Ghent. There's a theory, still unproven but disturbingly coherent, that the theft of the righteous judges panel wasn't the work of a lone obsessive or a gang of criminals. It was the desperate gambit of an illegal investment group comprising some of the most prominent members of Ghent's Catholic establishment. The theory involves the following people: Henri Corimont, a stockbroker and chair of the cathedral choir, whose father, Gerard, had been a minister of the Catholic Party in the 1890s and served as chief of the Belgian cabinet until 1918. Henri founded an investment company called Flanders Land Credit and held a number of government positions. You also have Arthur de Meester, an investor and secretary of the diocese in Ghent, who was also a priest in the Vaasland region of Belgium. He was the financial advisor to the diocese and selected its investments. He died ostensibly of problems related to alcoholism on May 30th, 1934, barely a month after the theft. The timing raised suspicions that his cause of death was not natural. Then you have Camille van Ogneval, director of a retirement facility in Ghent called Saint Antoine, which was run by the diocese. He stepped down in 1930, then became cantor of Saint Bavo. His brother Gustav van Ogneval was a local Catholic politician. It's also possible that Bishop Honoré Joseph Coppieters and Canon Gabriel van de Heijn were involved. And Arsène Goedertier was perhaps not the mastermind, but the ransomer, the middleman, the one who believed he was protecting the institution he loved. So here's how the theory goes. Camille van Ogneval supervised the collection of money from wealthy Catholic families, many of whom had ties to the retirement home he ran. He promised that the funds would be invested in Catholic charities, safe and virtuous investments that would do good while generating returns. Arthur de Meester then invested the money, or claimed to, and Henri Corimont drew up the contracts between the investors and the group, making everything look legitimate on paper. It's unclear exactly what happened to this money. Maybe they invested it in real projects that failed. Maybe some of the projects were fake to begin with, a kind of Ponzi scheme wrapped in Catholic respectability. What is clear is that Bishop Coppieters invested all of the diocese money into projects pursued by the group, receiving a percentage of profits for himself. Canon van de Heijn, acting as treasurer of Saint Bavo at this point, may have played along, though the theory suggests he wasn't truly involved, just aware and silent. In the winter of 1933 and 1934, Arthur de Meester received a tip about a lucrative investment that would require a lot of money raised quickly. But they raised the funds. And then on March 28, 1934, the Socialist Bank of Labor, which held the group's money, collapsed. And they lost everything. Panicked and frightened at the financial loss and the money owed to the investors, the potential ruin of the Catholic families involved, and the loss of face for both the families and the diocese itself, the group devised a plan to recuperate the money through the theft of the altarpiece. But here's where it gets complicated. The group argued over which plan to pursue. Bishop Coppieters, Canon van de Heijn, Arthur de Meester, and Arsène Goedertier wanted to keep the righteous judges panel on the cathedral premises, but feign its theft and coerce the Belgian government into paying the ransom for its return. The panel would never really leave. It would just be hidden, then found after the ransom was paid and everyone could claim victory. Camille and Gustav van Ogneval, along with Henri Corimont, wanted to sell the panel abroad. They thought they could get more money by cutting it into pieces, one piece for each painted figure in the judge's scene, and selling them individually. They knew a smuggler named Polydor Priam, then living on a houseboat in Ghent, who had contacts in America from his years spent there. Priam was certain he could procure an American buyer, even for the most famous painting in Belgium. But ultimately, the group agreed on the safer and more practical plan: ransom. Keep it local, keep it controllable. Get the money, return the panel, everyone walks away clean. The theft itself, according to this theory, was carried out by the Van Ogneval brothers. On the night of April 10, 1934, Camille entered the cathedral through the Roodloof, possibly using the generic key later found in Goedertier's home, which fit the Roodloof door. His brother Gustav may have been inside with him, helping to handle the large and unwieldy panels. They removed the Righteous Judges panel and the St. John the Baptist panel. Or, according to some versions of this theory, they only removed the St. John and left the judges hidden somewhere on the cathedral's premises. At 12:30 a.m., a small-time crook named Caesar Ericus, who happened to be stealing cheese from the shop across the street, saw a black car idling on the street that runs parallel to the cathedral. A portly man in a dark hat and overcoat paced nervously by the curb. Then a second man emerged from the shadows of the cathedral with something long wrapped in black cloth tucked under his arm. The two men fumbled with the car engine, struggling to start it, and Ericus crossed the street and offered to help. His offer was refused. The engine finally coughed to life, and the men drove off. Ericus would later identify the portly man as Polydor Priam, the smuggler. He claimed to recognize the second man too, though police records mysteriously failed to note who he said it was. The panels, or at least the St. John panel, were driven straight to Veteran, where they were handed off to Arsène Goedertier, who became the ransomer. He wrote the letters. He coordinated the negotiations. He rented the typewriter he typed the letters on under his fake passport name. He deposited 10,000 francs into a new bank account in April, possibly payment for his role, possibly just coincidence. Goedertier may have believed he was doing the right thing. He was helping his church, his bishop, his friend from school. The diocese was in trouble, and the families who had trusted them were in trouble. This was a way out. A sin, yes, but a sin committed for love, for duty, and for the preservation of something greater than himself. But then, when the ransom negotiations failed, and when the police refused to pay, Goedertier was left holding the blame for a scheme that had never been his idea in the first place. And when he died, conveniently, some would say, of a heart attack 7 months later, he became the perfect fall guy. So here's what makes this theory compelling. The ransom amount of 1 million francs seems too small to justify criminal measures, especially for people of this stature. Goedertier alone had 3 million francs in his bank account. He didn't need the money. But if the diocese had lost everything, if wealthy Catholic families were facing ruin, if the reputation of the church in Ghent was at stake, then maybe 1 million francs was enough to plug the hole and avoid exposure. It explains why the police investigation was so deliberately bungled. If members of the diocese were involved and other prominent Catholics were implicated, then catching the thieves would mean exposing the very people the authorities were supposed to protect. It also explains why George Deveau didn't go to the police after Goedertier's confession. He went to magistrates, to men who could control the narrative, who could decide what got investigated and what got buried. It explains why Franz de Heem, the Crown prosecuting attorney who had taken over ransom negotiations, was one of the 4 men Deveau consulted. De Heem had represented King Albert I before his death. If the theft was connected to debts owed by someone powerful, someone royal, de Heem would have known. And it explains why Canon Gabriel van de Heijn, the man who had risked his life to save the altarpiece during World War I, might have chosen silence over exposure. If the bishop was involved, if the institution was at risk, van de Heijn may have decided that protecting the church mattered more than recovering the panel. This is the dark irony at the heart of the story. The man who saved the painting from the Germans in 1914 may have helped bury it permanently in 1934. But we don't know for sure. Van Hein's role remains ambiguous and shadowed and unresolved. When Nazi art detective Heinrich Kohn arrived in Ghent in 1942, sent by Goebbels to find the judges' panel as a gift for Hitler, it was Van Hein who accompanied him on his search. The two of them toured the cathedral archives together and discovered that all of the files related to the theft had disappeared. They had vanished completely. Had Van Hein disposed of them in anticipation of Kohn's arrival, trying to protect secrets he couldn't afford to reveal? Or was he genuinely trying to help, hoping the Nazis would succeed where Belgian authorities had failed? We don't know. And that's part of what makes this story so haunting. Van Hein had been a hero once. He might have been a conspirator later. Or he might have been caught in the middle, torn between duty to the painting and duty to the institution, watching helplessly as the thing he had saved slipped further and further out of reach. He died in 1949, taking whatever he knew to the grave. The police officially closed the case in 1937, 3 years after the theft. Their conclusions? 1. Goedertier stole the painting. 2. Goedertier hid the righteous judge's panel. 3. Goedertier composed and sent the ransom notes. 4. On his deathbed, Goedertier tried to atone, but died before he could reveal sufficient information to recover the panel. 5. Goedertier acted alone. In police files, the panel was, and still is, labeled lost. In art terms, lost means the work may have been destroyed, damaged, or simply that its location is unknown. In police terms, it means the authorities have given up trying. But others didn't give up. Over the years, an array of amateur sleuths took up the case. In many instances, they made more progress than the professionals ever had. The first was Jean Ray, a fantasy novelist writing under the pseudonym John Flanders. In 1934, just months after the theft, he pointed out something the police had apparently missed or ignored. The false name under which Goedertier rented the typewriter, Arsène Van Dam, had the initials AVD, which reversed were D.U.A. It was a small clue, but clever, the kind of thing a man who loved spy novels might come up with. Then, in the 1990s, journalist Patrick Bernat began his own informal investigation. He suspected Goedertier may have been the ransomer and mastermind, but not the thief. He also thought the sudden manner of Goedertier's death was suspicious. Perhaps he'd been murdered. Bernat's prime suspects were two childhood friends of Goedertier's, both from the same town of Lied, Akil de Suif and Oscar Lievens. All three men sported nearly identical mustaches and goatees. Both de Suif and Lievens died suddenly within a few years of Goedertier's death. Both were suspected of being German spies. No homicide inquiries were made for any of the three deaths. Maria de Roo, another amateur sleuth, claimed that Oscar Lievens was the man with the pointy beard who returned the St. John panel via the Brussels rail station luggage check. She argued he was the only one who ever confessed to the theft, having done so to a blind man shortly before he died. Goedertier's widow, Julienne, recalled two things her husband had said that the police didn't consider relevant. 1. If I had to go looking for the panel, I would look on the outside of Saint Bavo. And 2, what's been displaced is not stolen. The first statement could corroborate suggestions made in the ransom letters that the panel was hidden in plain sight, in the Ghent city centre on the left-hand side of a prominent building. For the sake of convenience, the panel may never have left the premises of Saint Bavo Cathedral. The judges may have been removed from its frame and simply hidden elsewhere inside or outside the cathedral. This would explain why no trace of the panel was found in or around Goedertier's home. The second statement could explain how Goedertier rationalized the crime, and why he told the priest his conscience was at peace and denied last rites. He never really stole the panel. He simply displaced it, hid it, kept it safe until it could be returned. If these statements are true, then the panel might still be there, tucked behind wood paneling or slotted into a hollow in the wall, just waiting. From 1974 to 1991, Commissaire Karl Mortier conducted his own private investigation. He began studying the case as a hobby in 1956, but took it on full-time after his retirement in 1974. He was the first to approach it without the stain of conspiracy or ulterior motive, just pure fascination. After many years, Mortier gave up his investigation, but he wrote 4 books on the subject, although none of them have been translated into English. Mortier didn't solve the case, but he did reach some conclusions about why it remained unsolved. 1, the police work was so bad it had to be deliberate, a conspiracy to hide the truth. He compiled a dossier of evidence, the most significant of which was an account taken down by police in 1947 and then ignored, either because the case was closed or for the same reasons it had been mishandled in the first place. The account came from Caesar Erkes, the cheese thief. Arrested 13 years after the judge's theft on unrelated charges, Erkes tried to plea bargain by telling what he saw on the night of April 10th and 11th, 1934. His account is believed by many, including Mortier, but it was dismissed by police at the time. Erkes's claims should have been taken with caution, of course. He had every reason to provide information that might shorten his sentence. But the details he provided about seeing the car outside and identifying the smuggler as Polydor Priam were specific and plausible and oddly mundane in a way that fictional accounts rarely are. After all of his investigations, Mortier's best guess was that the panel was hidden somewhere in the wood paneling that runs throughout the cathedral. In 1996, he received $500,000 in funding from the Ministry of Culture and a team of technicians to search the cathedral with X-ray equipment. But after a little more than a week, only a portion of the cathedral had been searched, and the funds ran dry, so nothing has been discovered, and the search was eventually halted. Mortier also reported that Max Winders, a Belgian collaborator who worked with Heinrich Kohn, later said that Van de Heijn had found the panel. But no explanation was given as to why the man who had tried so hard to protect the painting during World War I did not reveal its whereabouts once World War II was over, if indeed it had been hidden in the cathedral initially and then moved to prevent the Nazis from finding it. Patrick Bernat, possibly the most widely read scholar of the mystery, believes that Goedertier and 2 accomplices, possibly De Suif and Levens, were acting as Nazi agents. Hitler came to power mere months before the work was stolen, and it's known the Ghent Altarpiece was one of his top targets. Bernat thinks there may be a link between the mystic lamb and the famous relic of the Holy Blood in Van Eyck's hometown of Bruges. He suggests Knights Templar are depicted in the Knights of Christ panel, and that there may have been an actual object or document hidden inside the judge's panel. He believes Goedertier and his accomplices were killed after they stole it. And indeed, Georges Deveau also died suddenly on November 4th, 1942, in a Ghent cinema, shortly after speaking with Nazi art detective Heinrich Kohn about what he knew of the lost panel. Dutch author Karl Hammer thinks Hitler wanted it because it contained a coded treasure map leading to the Arma Christi, the instruments used at Christ's Passion. He suggests it was being hidden from the Nazis, particularly Nazi Grail scholar Otto Rahn. However, none of these theories account for why Goedertier tried to ransom the panel back to the bishop. The most plausible explanation, the investment group theory, accounts for all of the confirmed information and provides what has been lacking from other interpretations: a logical motivation for Goedertier's involvement, and a rationale for a case that seems to have been subject to a massive cover-up from the start. It's possible Goedertier knew about the theft, but had no direct involvement in it, only in the subsequent ransom negotiation. It seems improbable, perhaps impossible, for the pudgy, poor-sighted Goedertier to have been the lone thief. But he could have been the ransom negotiator. He was the ransom negotiator. Perhaps his slip in the ransom notes from initially describing himself and the criminals in the plural to using the singular in the final notes was no mistake, but an indication that what was once a group effort had fallen to him alone to solve. If he could pull off the ransom demand successfully, there could be both a cash reward and a pardon for those involved. What would Goedertier stand to gain? Though his company Plantexel had gone bankrupt, he died with money in his account. He seems to have been a staunch and steadfast Catholic, far more likely to seek the recovery of church art than to steal it. Could his role have been that of a middleman, brought in after the theft was complete and when other avenues seemed closed in order to barter with the church? A role he accepted to ensure the return unharmed of the righteous judges. Some historians believe that to be the case, but it is far from conclusive. So even with all that we know and don't know about it, here's what haunts this case. Whether or not the investment group theory is true, whether or not the diocese was involved, one thing is undeniable. The investigation was deliberately sabotaged. Files disappeared, tests weren't published, the police never interviewed the most obvious witnesses, magistrates conducted secret inquiries, and the church obstructed journalists for decades. Someone, maybe several someones, didn't want this case solved. Maybe it was because recovering the panel would expose the theft, and exposing the theft would implicate people too powerful to touch. Maybe the cost of truth really was higher than the cost of loss. Or maybe we're seeing conspiracy where there's only incompetence, pattern where there's only chaos. But then you have to explain the missing files, the secret investigations, the sudden deaths, the silence that has lasted 90 years. That takes more than incompetence. That takes commitment. And maybe that's the real legacy of the 1934 theft. Not the mystery of where the panel is, of course that is fascinating, but the certainty of why it hasn't been found. Some truths are too expensive to reveal, and some secrets are worth more than masterpieces. The righteous judges panel is still missing. Or maybe it isn't. Maybe it's exactly where Goedertier said it would be, hidden in plain sight in a public place, somewhere on the left-hand side of Saint Bavo Cathedral, tucked behind wood paneling or slotted into a hollow in the wall. Maybe it's been there all along, waiting for someone brave enough or reckless enough to look. Some people who were certainly reckless enough to steal, for the final time, the remnants of the Ghent Altarpiece, were the Nazis. In the next episode, we'll go inside the salt mine in Austria where it remained stored throughout World War II and meet the people brave enough to try to save it. But for now, stick around to hear about the strange mid-century development in the case of the missing righteous judges panel. In 1939, working in secret and entirely under his own direction, Jeff van der Vecken, a celebrated conservator at the Royal Museum of Fine Arts, known for his uncanny ability to not just restore old paintings, but to make them look as though they had never aged at all, began painting a replica of the missing judges panel on a 200-year-old cupboard door he'd cut precisely to size. He used old photographs, surviving sketches, and a 16th century copy as his guide. It took him 6 years. Van der Vecken was prized in his era for being able to make paintings look brand new again, and he enjoyed making copies of famous works using centuries-old supports, aging them artificially to give them the craquelure and patina of age. When he finished his version of the Righteous Judges in 1945, it was so convincing, so masterfully executed, that it was as if the panel had never left. He signed his work in rhyme, carving a cryptic verse on the back in Flemish that said, "I did it for love and for duty, and to avenge myself. I borrowed from the dark side." No one quite knew what he meant by that. Love for what? Duty to whom? And what did he borrow from the dark side? In 1950, Van der Vecken's judges panel was installed into the altarpiece. And there it remained, quietly accepted as a placeholder, a stand-in, a ghost where the original used to be. And then, in the spring of 1974, Joost Trotijn, a surrealist painter and conservator who had been cleaning the Ghent Altarpiece every Easter for 20 years, was working on the Righteous Judges panel when something struck him as wrong. He'd looked at this copy hundreds of times. He knew it was Van der Wecken's work, painted during World War II on an old cupboard door. But this time, peering through his magnifying glass, the craquelure looked different. The patina of age looked too real, too consistent with the 15th century panels surrounding it. He examined the figure of Leopold III, which Van der Wecken had inserted into his version of the painting to distinguish it from the original. Leopold was definitely there, but beneath the surface, Trotijn thought he could see something else. Faint outlines, a pentimento revealing itself, as if another figure had been painted over. Confused, Trotijn called his friend Hugo de Pooter, a fellow painter. Together, they compared the supposed copy to the known original panels. And to their eyes, the Righteous Judges panel looked indistinguishable from the 500-year-old sections of the altarpiece. Trotijn alerted the bishopric and local museum officials. Shortly after, Belgian newspapers picked up the story. The international art community took notice. Was it possible the missing panel had been returned in disguise? Tests were quietly conducted by cathedral officials and university scientists, but the results were never published. Instead, Monsignor van Kessel, one of the cathedral's staff, stepped forward to announce the findings. The tests, he said, showed no irregular underpainting. The mixture of plaster and glue that Van Eyck used to make his underlying white gesso preparatory layer was different from the gesso layer on the judges panel. Wood and grain particles had also been tested and showed it was indeed a copy, not the missing original. Case closed. Except the doubts persisted. Some wondered if Van der Wecken had painted over the real panel, restoring it in reverse, concealing it beneath his own brushwork. And perhaps over the decades, his paint layer had faded, allowing Van Eyck's original to shine through once more. Others believed the bishopric had been complicit from the beginning, orchestrating the theft and later the panel's covert return, with Van der Wecken as their silent accomplice. His cryptic rhyme, they said, wasn't a confession of guilt, but of duty fulfilled. There were other oddities. Van der Wecken began his copy in 1939, just 1 year after the final ransom attempt in 1938. Coincidence or choreography? And why, if the original had truly been returned, not simply leave it at a museum's doorstep with an anonymous tip? Why smuggle it back in secret, tucked behind a king's likeness? But the official story remains unchanged. The Righteous Judges panel was stolen in 1934. Arsène Goedertier was responsible. A copy was made during World War II, and the original is lost. But for some who have stood before the Ghent Altarpiece and stared into the faces of Van der Wecken's judges, the nobles on horseback, with their meticulous detail, the luminous depth that seems to glow from within the panel, there lingers a suspicion, quiet and persistent and unprovable, that what we're looking at isn't a replica at all. It's a resurrection. And if that's true, then the painting was never really lost. It was hidden, displaced, buried under layers of paint and silence and institutional shame. And maybe that's the most fitting end to this story. The panel returned not through confession or investigation or justice, but through the patient work of a conservator who understood that sometimes the only way to save something is to make it invisible. Van der Wecken died in 1964, 20 years after completing his copy. He never explained what he meant by that cryptic verse. He wasn't alive to confirm or deny the rumors that he'd painted over the original. He simply left his work behind, signed with a riddle, daring anyone who looked closely enough to see what was really there. The Righteous Judges panel hangs in Saint Bavo Cathedral today. Whether it's the original or a copy, whether it was returned in secret or lost forever, whether Van der Wecken was a forger or a savior, we still don't know. This episode was written, narrated, and produced by me, Emma Laramie. If you enjoyed this story, if something here surprised you, made you think differently, or just gave you something interesting to talk about over drinks with friends, do me a favor. Follow the show. Leave a rating or a review if you're feeling generous. And if there's an artist or moment in art history you're curious about, drop a comment below. Thanks for listening. I'll see you next time.